there was so many messages that were core to IHOP that you talked about shaping the groupthink. The one that I'm seeing now, and I don't have, you're the research guy. I don't have all the research and stuff, but this is my opinion. Whenever I was a part of the movement, one of the things, the groupthink topics that shaped us a lot, was always who your enemy was. That was always a thing. And I've noticed, especially since Roe v. Wade was overturned, I've noticed a subtle shift of what those enemies are. Whenever I was in Kansas City, it was always abortion and homosexuality. Like those were the enemies. They're doing gay conversion therapy, and they were going and protesting abortion clinics and standing on the steps of the Supreme Courthouse and such. And now I've seen that change to now it's around, and people have many different opinions around this issue, but around gender identity and trans people, and bathrooms and all this, we hear it in the news all the time as well. Like the religious portion of society has so much sway in there. But those are one of the subtle things that I see that they paint a target and get us thinking one way, and you never actually have conversations with these people. You never have a conversation with someone who had to have an abortion. You never had a conversation with someone who identified as gay or someone who was trans, or the list goes on and on. But there was much more strategic stuff too. The one I've been thinking about the most recently, intimacy with God was a huge theme, which is a whole thing we could dive into with Bridal Paradigm and Song of Solomon and all that kind of thing. But before you even got into the weird stuff, like the things that most preachers in America would agree with whenever they heard Mike talk about it, is he would talk about the first and second commandment. And he would talk about the importance of the first commandment, that we would love God with everything, with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. But what people didn't notice was the subtle pitting of the two, of the first commandment and the second commandment. The second one's like it, that you love your neighbor as yourself. And we see through the rest of Scripture, again, my opinion, we see through the rest of Scripture, look at Matthew 25, and Jesus talks about whatever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. But with a place like IHOP, you construct a whole worldview and theology and system around this prayer room and intercession and worship and all these things. And whenever you hear that first commandment message, now prayer room, worship, all this stuff becomes the most important things, because this is how we love God. And what we've seen happen as a result was the neglect of people in the community around us. I'm not even talking about the homeless population of Kansas City or the food insecure in Kansas City. I'm talking about the cult members. Like, we saw that it was more important that you kept your Sacred Trust prayer room hours. Or Sacred Trust was like your 40 hours or 24 hours if you're a student that you committed to in the prayer room a week. That was more important than any relationship, because first commandment was most important. Loving God was more important than your family, more important than your friends. And so I've had to do a whole lot of detangling in that regard. But that's one of those subtle manipulation things of you define something for people and you give them a goal to hit. Like, they're going to do everything they can to do that. If you say that that's what's pleasing to God, that it's pleasing to God that you do this. And there was a whole lot more subtle stuff to it around, justice and how they define justice, which impacted the loving your neighbor portion. That if it wasn't prayer, worship, evangelism, you could go feed as many people as you want. But if you fed people and didn't tell them about Jesus, you were the Antichrist. And they would say that verbatim from the platform. So there's so much subtle stuff like that. That now, I left in 2012. We're 12 years later, and I'm just now detangling that whole message in the past 6 months or so.
It's a lot to detangle because, like you said, they want to have an enemy. It's an us versus them mentality. They have to have an enemy. And it's like, it's not that that's limited to the cult. Look in politics. If you can incite anger in a crowd and get them to hate something, and then say that your platform is the one that solves the issue that's causing this hate, you've united the people, and anger is very powerful. Even even the prophet Yoda said, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate. And the problem is they don't realize the last part of that, hate leads to suffering. And you look at the similarities between the two, IHOPKC, Branhamism, and then all of the movements historically that sparked Branhamism. They begin with fear, which the prophet Yoda explained to us. You get the people to fear something, then you can turn them to turn anger against it, and then eventually to hatred. And it's always that strategy to manipulate the crowd. And I'm not going to say that Bickle and some of these others are listening to the prophet Yoda, but there's a pattern that you can look through from politicians to just ancient history. That's the way in which you take a group of people in a mind think type scenario and then turn them into an army.
You mix in the visions of grandeur kind of idea that gets swept up to. There's so many big pictures painted. You mentioned Joel's army, and I start thinking about all the prophetic history and stuff. I mean, one of the big parts of that was that there would be this big Blue Ridge procession, is what they called it, where it was going to be apostles and prophets marching from Forerunner Church in Grandview to Arrowhead Stadium. and that was a big thing. And they've tried to self-fulfill that a couple times, most recently, like 2 years ago, where they tried to do a thing and did this big, they rented out Arrowhead Stadium. And it was kind of sad because they did a lot of image management around it. I don't know how, I'd hate to guess, but the stadium wasn't more than 20% full. They packed everybody on the field around the stage and stuff, and then you look up and you're like, man, this place is empty. But it was a huge push. But whenever you set those were the things that were set in front of us that kept us in the fire. I like that metaphor. That you would be the big worship leader, you would be the apostle, you would be the prophet, and there's so many friends that are coming to mind right now who had those exact things spoken over them. I had a friend who they were like, "You're going to be one of the apostles in the Blue Ridge procession." Like that's what was prophesied over him, or you're going to be the next this worship leader or that worship leader, and that's how they kept you there. Was that.
It all comes down to control. If you can control the people, you can point them wherever you want and turn them into your army and do your bidding. And that's essentially what was happening here. You talked about...
It's so subtle.
Oh, yeah. You talked about renting Arrowhead Stadium. I remember when I was a kid, most of the people who are in the Branham cults will probably not even remember this, but... the end time was near because Bill Clinton got elected. It's so weird how politics ties into all of this.